You wake already tired. Not the clean tiredness of work, but a dull weakness that lives behind your eyes. Your stomach tightens, then loosens, then tightens again, as if searching for something that is no longer there. Your mouth tastes sour. Standing makes you lightheaded. Walking feels heavier than it should. The day has begun, but you are already running on what your body saved from yesterday, and there was little saved then, too. Hunger in the Middle Ages rarely arrived suddenly. It crept in. It stretched itself across weeks, sometimes months, thinning people long before it broke them. For most ordinary men, women, and children, famine was not a single catastrophic moment, but a season that refused to end. Food did not disappear overnight. It became smaller, weaker, less nourishing, until eating no longer meant being fed. The most dangerous time was not winter, but the weeks before harvest. By late spring and early summer, stored grain was nearly gone. What remained had been eaten cautiously, then desperately. Bread loaves shrank, porridge grew thinner. Families stretched meals by adding water, then more water, until warmth replaced nourishment. This period became known simply as the hungry time, a phase so predictable that communities expected it, feared it, and yet were rarely able to escape it. Bread was supposed to be the foundation of life. When grain was scarce, people did not stop eating bread, they changed what bread meant. Flour was stretched with whatever could be ground, soaked, or crushed into powder. Peas and beans were dried and milled into rough meal. Acorns were leached in water to reduce bitterness, then dried and ground. Even grasses and seeds were scraped from fields and paths, mixed into dough that barely held together. These loaves were dark, heavy, and difficult to digest. They filled the stomach briefly, then left it aching. When true flour ran out entirely, substitutes grew more dangerous. Bark from trees, especially elm and pine, was stripped, dried, and ground into fibrous dust. It had almost no nutritional value, but it gave shape to dough and the illusion of food. Bran normally discarded from milling was eaten raw or boiled, irritating the gut and worsening weakness over time. Straw, chaff, and husks appeared in bread not as accident, but intention. Hunger lowered standards first, then erased them. Foraging expanded beyond what was safe or familiar. People gathered roots that were normally avoided, bitter leaves pulled from ditches, weeds scraped from stone walls. Nettles, docks, sorrel, and wild mustard were boiled again and again to soften their taste and texture. In good years, these plants supplemented meals. In bad years, they became the meal. Knowledge of which plants could be eaten without killing you was uneven, and mistakes were common. Hunger made risk feel reasonable. Animal food did not vanish, but it changed form. Livestock were too valuable to slaughter casually. They represented future milk, labor, or offspring. What people ate instead were the parts normally thrown away. Blood was caught and cooked. Bones were cracked and boiled repeatedly to extract whatever fat or marrow remained. Hooves, heads, and internal organs were simmered until they fell apart, producing thin broths that smelled strong and satisfied little. Once the animal scraps were gone, they were boiled again. Leather followed. Old shoes, belts, straps, and tool bindings were soaked, scraped, and boiled for hours. The result was a gelatinous mass with almost no nourishment, but it softened hunger's edge for a moment. Leather meals were a sign that all ordinary food options had already failed. They did not sustain life, they postponed collapse. Religion shaped how hunger was understood, but did not protect against it. Fasting was meant to be chosen, controlled, and temporary. Forced hunger was none of these. In famine years, the boundary between religious discipline and starvation blurred. People were expected to endure with humility, but prolonged lack of food stripped hunger of meaning. Faith did not fill stomachs. It only helped some endure the waiting. The body paid the price quietly at first. Strength faded, wounds healed slowly, illness lingered. People became more susceptible to cold, infection, and exhaustion. Hunger changed behavior before it destroyed health. Work slowed, tempers shortened, trust weakened.
survival became a private calculation. This was not yet collapse, it was adaptation, fragile, temporary, and unequal. Some places endured longer than others. Some households survived while their neighbors did not. Hunger exposed the thin line between stability and desperation, and most people lived their lives close to that line, even in years that history would later call normal. Hunger did not press on everyone in the same way. Where you lived determined not only what you ate, but how long you could keep eating at all. In the countryside, famine unfolded slowly, bound to fields and seasons. In towns and cities, it arrived faster, sharper, and with fewer escape routes. Rural families lived closer to food sources, but that closeness was deceptive. When crops failed, peasants had little else to fall back on. Fields that once fed them became empty stretches of soil. Seed grain meant for the next planting was eaten early, guaranteeing future scarcity in exchange for present survival. Once that choice was made, there was no reversal. A household might live through the season, but the land would punish them later. Foraging expanded outward in widening circles. First came the edges of fields, then forests, then land that technically belonged to someone else. Roots were dug up before they matured. Young shoots were taken before they could grow. This stripped the landscape of renewal. What had once been an emergency measure became a habit, then a necessity, until nothing remained to gather. Hunger consumed the future as efficiently as it consumed the present. In towns, the problem was different. Urban populations depended on grain arriving from elsewhere. When war disrupting roads, when merchants withheld supplies to raise prices, or when authorities failed to regulate markets, cities starved quickly. Urban poor had no fields, no forests, and limited ability to forage. What they ate came from refuse, scraps, and whatever could be purchased with rapidly devalued wages. Market bread became unreliable. Bakers mixed flour with fillers, not just to stretch supply, but to maintain profit. Loaves grew heavier and cheaper, but less sustaining. Complaints were common, but hunger reduced choice. People bought what existed, even when it made them sick. Bread riots were not sudden explosions of anger. They were the final stage of prolonged quiet suffering, when hunger turned collective. As food scarcity deepened, social behavior shifted. Theft increased, not out of malice, but arithmetic. A stolen loaf meant one family might eat that day while another did not. Laws became harsher, but enforcement grew uneven. Authorities struggled to punish starvation without appearing cruel, yet punishment continued. Hunger criminalized survival. Animals within cities fared no better. Rats, dogs, and cats, once tolerated or ignored, became sources of meat. This was not done lightly or universally, but it happened often enough to be noted. The distinction between livestock and vermin blurred under pressure. Waste pits were searched. Grease was scraped from cooking vessels long after meals were finished. Water used to boil food was saved and reused, thickening with residue, carrying both calories and disease. Even so, hunger rarely killed quickly. It weakened first. People learned to sit more, move less, speak less. Children grew thin and quiet. The elderly disappeared from records without comment. Chronic undernourishment reshaped bodies over years, shortening lifespans without drama. A person could survive famine and still never recover fully. Community bonds were tested. Mutual aid existed, shared pots, pooled grain, informal charity, but it had limits. When everyone was hungry, generosity became dangerous. Trust narrowed to family, then to self. Memory of famine lingered long after food returned. People hoarded when they could. They saved scraps that no longer had value. Hunger taught lessons that prosperity never erased. Religious institutions sometimes offered relief, sometimes failed entirely. Monasteries with stored grain could help briefly, but even they were bound by finite supplies. Prayers multiplied when food did not. Meaning was sought where sustenance was absent. Hunger was interpreted as punishment, trial, or fate, depending on who spoke, but interpretations did not alter outcomes. What emerges from these patterns is not chaos, but strain. Medieval society bent under hunger before it broke. Systems adapted poorly, slowly, unevenly. Survival depended less on strength than on access, timing, and luck. Those who lived through famine carried it with them, in habits, in fear, in memory, shaping how they approached every meal that followed. When hunger lingered, it changed how people understood food itself. Eating was no longer about satisfaction or even strength. It became a calculation. What could be swallowed? What could be kept down? What delayed collapse by a few hours? Taste mattered less than texture. Smell became a warning rather than an invitation. People learned to distrust fullness because it never lost it. One of the most damaging consequences of prolonged scarcity was that substitutes often made hunger worse over time. Bark bread and bran-heavy loaves filled the stomach but irritated the body. Fibers that could not be digested scraped weakened intestines. Swelling followed eating, creating the illusion of nourishment while muscles continued to waste. People felt full and starved at the same time. This confusion exhausted the body further, blurring the signals that once guided survival. Repeated boiling became a universal technique. Anything remotely edible was boiled, not just to soften it, but to make it safer. Bitter plants lost some toxins. Old bones released faint traces of fat. Leather broke down into something chewable. The resulting broths were thin, often cloudy, carrying smell more than substance. Yet warmth itself became valuable. Hot liquids slowed shaking, eased pain, and briefly restored a sense of normalcy. Salt, when available, became as important as food. It preserved scraps, enhanced flavor, and helped bodies retain what little nutrition they received. Without it, weakness deepened. In regions where salt was scarce or expensive, hunger struck harder. Preservation failed. Meat rotted before it could be consumed. Fish spoiled. The absence of salt turned shortage into disaster. Children suffered differently than adults. Their bodies adapted quickly but incompletely. Growth slowed, limbs thinned. Survivors of childhood famine often carried permanent effects: shorter stature, fragile health, reduced resistance to illness. Hunger wrote itself into bones and teeth, leaving marks that remained long after memories faded. These were not visible tragedies in the moment. They revealed themselves gradually, over years. Women, especially pregnant or nursing, faced impossible demands. Their bodies were expected to sustain others while barely sustaining themselves. Milk failed. Infants were weaned early onto thin gruels that offered little protection. Infant mortality rose quietly, absorbed into daily life as something expected rather than exceptional. Hunger narrowed the future by reducing those who would live long enough to shape it. As scarcity persisted, moral boundaries shifted. Acts once unthinkable became tolerated, then common. Fields were raided at night. Storehouses were broken into. Food was hidden even from neighbors. Trust dissolved unevenly, faster in cities, slower in villages, but nowhere immune. Hunger did not create cruelty, but it removed the energy required for restraint. Authorities responded inconsistently. Some attempted price controls, rationing, or grain redistribution. Others protected merchants and landowners, worsening resentment. Enforcement required strength and resources, both diminished during famine. As governance weakened, informal systems filled the gaps. Favors, debts, threats. Food became power in its simplest form. The long-term effects of repeated hunger extended beyond the body. Memory shaped behavior. People who survived famine wasted nothing, even in abundance. Breadcrumbs were saved. Fat was prized. Meals were eaten quickly, without trust that the next would come. Hunger taught lessons that prosperity never erased.
What emerges from these experiences is not a story of sudden collapse, but of endurance under erosion. Medieval people survived not because their diets were adequate, but because they adapted continuously, lowering expectations again and again. Each adaptation carried a cost: physical, social, psychological, paid slowly, often invisibly. Hunger did not end when food returned. It left traces in bodies, in customs, in the way people approached every loaf thereafter. Survival was achieved not through abundance, but through adjustment, a narrowing of life to what could be sustained, one weakened day at a time. Hunger reshaped medieval life not as a single disaster, but as a recurring condition that people learned to expect. It influenced how communities planned, how families behaved, and how individuals understood their own bodies. Food scarcity was not an interruption of normal life. For many, it was part of normal life. Over time, people adjusted their expectations downward. Full stomachs became rare. Energy was rationed as carefully as food. Days were organized around conserving strength rather than productivity. Work slowed, not out of laziness, but necessity. Hunger taught restraint before it taught desperation. Only when restraint failed did collapse begin. Belief systems absorbed hunger quietly. Prayers for survival became routine rather than urgent. Hunger was interpreted through religion, custom, and memory, but it remained physical above all else. Faith might explain suffering, but it did not soften it. What sustained people was not belief alone, but habit, knowing how to stretch a meal, how to endure weakness, how to wait. Memory played a powerful role. Communities remembered which foods had kept them alive before, even if those foods were barely edible. Knowledge of edible weeds, bark preparation, and preservation techniques passed down without ceremony. These were not celebrated skills, they were contingency plans carried quietly from one generation to the next, ready to be used again. Hunger also reshaped social boundaries. Charity existed, but it was fragile. Solidarity narrowed under pressure. Famine revealed who had reserves, who had power, and who had none. It taught people where they stood in society with painful clarity. Survival depended less on virtue than on access to land, to storage, to networks that could absorb loss. The body remembered even when the mind tried to forget. Survivors carried weakness forward along with caution. Eating habits hardened into patterns of saving, hoarding, and mistrust of abundance. Waste became unthinkable. Hunger altered not just what people ate, but how they thought about food forever after. Medieval people did not survive famine through heroism or endurance alone. They survived through adaptation, by redefining what food was, what hunger meant, and how little was enough to continue. These adjustments kept people alive, but they also narrowed life, reducing it to persistence rather than growth. When food finally returned, it did not erase what hunger had done. The experience lingered in bodies, behaviors, and memory. Hunger became a quiet reference point, a reminder of how thin the margin of survival truly was and how easily it could vanish again. In this way, famine shaped medieval society not only through loss, but through the habits left behind. Survival was not triumphant, it was restrained, cautious, and deeply aware of its limits. If you found this story meaningful, consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps support the channel and allows this documentary to reach a wider audience.